I'm going to install the components to the secondary side of the throttle bodies. So firstly we need to remove the air temp sensor from the original plenum, carefully wiggle it out, and it simply gets pushed back in to the lug on the side of the new throttle bodies. Firmly push that in, and it just faces downwards like that. And you can see here the brake servo connections have already been put in. You basically do them up so that there's about a 1mm gap between the nut and the face of the mounting. Joining pipe between them, and then the extension which goes off to the brake servo pipe on the car goes here. We can also put the new throttle position sensor on. This is quite a delicate piece of kit, so it doesn't need to be forced. There is a D inside that corresponds to the shape on the spindle. Carefully slide that over and insert the button head. It's now ready for installation on the car. The next thing we're going to do is install the primary throttle bodies onto the engine. So having removed the blue towel from the inlet ports, take our inlet manifold gasket, line it up with the bolt holes on the left here, and then we're just going to pop one of the M8 cap-head bolts through and then pop it into the engine bay. Obviously working around the wires, just keeping some pressure on there. We just need to align that bolt in there and just loosely do it up, just so it's holding everything in place. Next we're going to put another bolt in underneath just to secure the angle. Again, this just needs to be lightly done up with the gasket still free floating so that we can adjust the position once everything is installed. So at this stage nothing gets done up tightly, so everything can be moved. After the primary set goes in, the secondaries can go on, and it's important to focus on this particular area here. This is the linkage between the left and right banks. This is a spring, and this slides over this lever here when you install them. So just getting the bodies into position and just very gently manoeuvre this over so that it sits over the top of the lever, and then with the M8 cap head back in, we'll need to move the gasket again to align the holes up. Take your Allen key and gently do up the bolts. With nothing actually done up tightly, we can now check that these are now linked together, which they are. By checking through the front, you can see all 4 butterflies moving at the same time. What we're now going to do is put all the bolts into the throttle bodies, line up the gasket and torque them up. As a side note, it's important to only put the washers on the top rung of the throttle bodies and use non-washer on the bottom. The next section is to put the engine support block into its position. Now this is a very tight fit, so what we need to do is allow us a little bit of extra room by slackening off the cam belt cover, taking the bolts out, and this will allow us to move this to one side to give us some more clearance. To do this we use a 16mm ring spanner or a normal spanner or a socket, take off the nuts here and the bolts, then we can move this to one side. Installing this, you can now see the reasons why it's very important to have moved the alternator support bracket and the cam belt cover so they're free to move. Just popping this in here to get it lined up, just pull the alternator support bracket out of the way and carefully position this in its slot. Now that the engine mount support block is in position, we need to get the original bolts through the hole. So just gently line that up, and you may have to wiggle the support block and see it go into the cylinder head. There we go. And then we need to do the side manifold bolt as well. And the same procedure, just give it a bit of a wiggle And there we go, the thread's taken, and that's ready to do up once we've aligned the throttle bodies with the cylinder head. Before we do any nuts and bolts up, it is really important to make sure the throttle bodies are aligned with the cylinder head. So what we're going to do here, using a torch, open the throttle bodies and have a look down each one of the ports to check that the gasket and the bodies are aligned with the aperture on the cylinder head. If they're not, then we need to move them around ever so slightly until they do, because a mismatch between the two will cause a lack of performance. Once we're satisfied that the throttle bodies are aligned with the head, we can now go around all the cap head bolts on the throttle bodies and just nip them up so that the body cannot move on their own. The next section is going to be slightly more tricky, getting the lower manifold bolts in. It's basically get them in by hand, just reach around as you can, pop them into the holes and get them finger tight. Going with your Allen key, just make sure they've taken into the thread. Last thing you want to do is cross threads, so be very careful and do them gently to start with. With the shortest extension you can, you now need to torque the throttle body bolts up. Now we're going to set them to 25 Newton meters. This is sufficient to have them up tightly, but not enough to cause any damage to the threads. For the final throttle body bolts, you need to do the ones that are going through the engine's mount support block. So you do the front one first, and then you need to do the one on the side, and then finally the one through the top. Once we've done the side manifold bolt up here, we can now put the rest of the cam belt cover nuts and bolts back on, and they can be done up tightly. As we previously said, having degassed professionally the air conditioning system to remove all the pressure, we need to now rotate this pipe round to clear the front of the throttle. There you clearly see it's in the way. Now there is one 10mm bolt here which we need to slightly slacken off. It just needs a couple of turns, and if it hasn't been moved for a long time, which fortunately this one has, spray some lubricating, something like WD-40 or Butylene or Worth spray down there, and then you can gently manipulate the pipe round by wiggling it and turning at the same time. And this allows us to clear the front of the bodies to give uninterrupted airflow. Once that's moved, you need to nip the bolt back up again. It doesn't need to be particularly tight, just a little bit of a turn on there so it doesn't come undone again. And then that's clear and out of the way, and then we just need to make sure these are still free and no tension on the pipes.